I've been sitting here for the past hour going through the data from the United States. I have to tell you, what's unfolding is quite remarkable from an analytical standpoint. Not remarkable in a good way, mind you, but remarkable in the sense that we're watching economic theory play out in real time with all the predictability of a textbook case study. Let me start with what caught my attention this morning. The polling data. Now, I know Americans have a complicated relationship with polls, but when you see consistency across multiple independent surveys, you have to pay attention. Trump's approval rating on economic issues has fallen to 38%. To put that in perspective, that's lower than Biden ever polled on the economy, even during the worst of the inflation crisis in 2021 and 2022. Fox News, which one would hardly call hostile territory for Trump, is reporting these numbers. When your own supporters' preferred media outlet is publishing data like this, you know something fundamental has shifted. But here's what's truly fascinating from an economic perspective. We're watching a case study in the disconnect between macroeconomic indicators and lived experience. The American stock market is hitting record highs. On paper, GDP growth is positive. Unemployment remains relatively low. And yet, 76% of voters view the economy negatively. 76%. That's not a majority, that's a supermajority. That's a consensus. Now, why is this happening? Well, it comes down to something we economists sometimes forget in our models. People don't eat GDP. They don't pay rent with stock market gains. They pay for groceries, electricity, housing, and on those metrics, the story is very different. Consumer prices have risen 1.7% on average during Trump's second term. That might not sound like much, but remember, this comes on top of the significant inflation of 2021 through 2023. We're talking about cumulative effects. Grocery prices are up 1.4% since January. Coffee prices are up nearly 20% year over year. These are the things people notice every single day. But here's where it gets interesting from a policy perspective. Trump ran on a very specific promise. He would bring prices down. Not slow inflation, mind you, but actually reduce prices. That's deflation. And any first-year economic student can tell you why sustained deflation is something you absolutely do not want in a modern economy. It's associated with recessions, depressions, massive unemployment. But Trump made that promise and voters believed him. Now he's trapped by his own rhetoric. Let me talk about the tariffs, because this is where economic theory meets political reality in the most painful way possible. Trump has implemented what can only be described as the most aggressive tariff regime since the Great Depression. The average tariff rate has jumped from 2.5% at the beginning of the year to 13.6%. That's more than a five-fold increase. Now, the administration's position is that tariffs are paid by foreign countries. This is, and I'm being as diplomatic as possible here, not how tariffs work. A tariff is a tax on imports paid by the importer, which is almost always a domestic company or consumer. This isn't controversial economics. This is literally the definition. The data bears this out. Research from Harvard, from the Peterson Institute, from the Tax Foundation, all showing the same thing. American consumers are paying for these tariffs. The Tax Foundation estimates that Trump's tariffs amount to an average tax increase of $1,200 per household in 2025, rising to $1,600 in 2026. That's the largest tax increase since 1993. And what are Americans getting for this tax increase? Well, the stated goal was to bring manufacturing back to the United States, to create jobs, to rebuild the industrial base. Noble goals, theoretically. But here's the problem. Even if this strategy works, and that's a very big if, it takes years to build factories, train workers, establish supply chains. Years. Meanwhile, consumers are paying higher prices right now, today. Every time they go to the grocery store, Harvard economists did something quite clever. They calculated what inflation would have been without the tariffs. They're finding, instead of 3% inflation, it would have been 2.2%. In other words, the tariffs are directly responsible for keeping inflation elevated above the Federal Reserve's target. This matters enormously because it means the Fed has to keep interest rates higher than they otherwise would, which means higher borrowing costs for mortgages, car loans, business investment. It's a cascading effect. UBS put out a report recently that I found quite stark. They estimate the tariffs will add 0.8 percentage points to core inflation in 2026. That's enough to erase a year's worth of progress. They also noted something that should alarm anyone. A decent chunk of the US economy is in recession. Not the whole economy, but significant sectors. Real residential investment, non-residential construction, both contracting. The only thing holding up growth is the AI investment boom and consumption by upper-income households benefiting from stock market wealth. This is what we call a K-shaped recovery. The top doing very well, the bottom struggling. And politically, that's dynamite. Let me now turn to what happened on November 4th and 5th, because this is where the economic discontent translated into political action. The United States held off-year elections in several states. These are always viewed as a bellwether for the following year's midterm elections. And the results were, from the Republican perspective, catastrophic. Virginia and New Jersey both elected Democratic governors by double-digit margins. In Virginia, the Democrat won by 15 points. 15. New Jersey, similar numbers. New York City elected a self-described democratic socialist as mayor with over 1 million votes. In all these races, exit polls showed the same thing. Voters said the economy and cost of living were their top concerns, and they voted for Democrats by overwhelming margins. Now, Trump's immediate response was to say he wasn't on the ballot, and there was a government shutdown affecting things. Both true. But here's what's revealing. Just 1 year ago, these same areas voted much more favorably for Republicans. Trump himself won New Jersey's Passaic County in 2024, the first Republican to do so since 1992. This year, the Democrat won it by 15 points. That's an 18-point swing in 1 year. What does this tell us? It tells us that voters are directly connecting their economic pain to Trump's policies. And they're punishing Republicans for it. The polling backs this up. When asked who is more responsible for current economic conditions, 62% say Trump, only 32% say Biden. That's a massive shift from just a few months ago. And critically, 61% say Trump's policies have worsened economic conditions. That's higher than Biden ever polled on that question, even during the worst of the 2021 to 2022 inflation surge. Now, let's talk about what Trump has tried to do in response, because this is where political desperation meets economic reality. First, he scrapped tariffs on about 200 food products, including coffee, beef, bananas, tomatoes. This is significant not because of the economic impact, which will be modest, but because of what it represents. A complete reversal of his signature policy when faced with political pressure. Trump built his entire economic philosophy around tariffs. He's called them the most beautiful word in the dictionary. He said the United States would be a poor nation without them. And then, faced with electoral disaster and cratering poll numbers, he removes tariffs on 200 products. The message this sends is that either he doesn't actually believe in his own policy, or he believes in it, but is willing to abandon it for political survival. Either way, it's not a good look. Second, he's floated the idea of $2,000 rebate checks funded by tariff revenue. Now, as an economist, this is, let me choose my words carefully, problematic on multiple levels. If tariffs are generating revenue, that means imports are still happening and Americans are still paying the higher prices. So you're taking money from Americans via higher prices, cycling it through the government and giving some of it back. That's inefficient by any measure. Moreover, sending out checks risks fueling further inflation, which would then require the Federal Reserve to keep rates high, which would reduce the purchasing power of those checks. It's circular logic. Third, and this is perhaps most telling, he's been verbally attacking Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell with increasing ferocity. Just yesterday, he said he would love to fire his ass. He called Powell grossly incompetent. He's pressuring Treasury Secretary Bessent to somehow force Powell to lower interest rates. Here's the thing about central bank independence. It exists for a reason. The research on this is unambiguous. Countries with independent central banks have lower and more stable inflation over time. Why? Because independent central banks can make unpopular decisions like raising interest rates to cool an overheating economy without worrying about political retribution. The moment a central bank becomes subject to political pressure, credibility evaporates. And when credibility evaporates, inflation expectations become unanchored. And when inflation expectations become unanchored, you get inflation. Trump appointed Powell in 2017. Powell has done exactly what the Federal Reserve Chair is supposed to do, respond to economic conditions with monetary policy aimed at achieving the Fed's dual mandate of maximum employment and stable prices. He lowered rates dramatically during COVID. He raised them when inflation surged. He's now lowering them gradually as inflation comes down, but carefully, because inflation is still above target. The fact that Trump is threatening to fire Powell is deeply concerning from an institutional perspective. The Federal Reserve Act says the president can only remove the Fed chair for cause which legal scholars interpret as serious misconduct or malfeasance, not policy disagreements. If Trump attempts to fire Powell, it would almost certainly trigger a constitutional crisis and cause market chaos. Bond yields would spike. The dollar would likely fall. Borrowing costs would surge. It would be economic self-harm. Let me now tie this all together, because there's a larger pattern here that I think is crucial to understand. What we're seeing is the collision of campaign promises with economic reality, filtered through the reality of democratic accountability. Trump promised to quickly bring down prices. He promised that tariffs would make America wealthy. He promised to bring back manufacturing. He promised that his policies would create the greatest economy in American history. These promises got him elected. But the reality is that prices are sticky, downward. Inflation has come down from its peak, but prices themselves remain elevated. That's normal, that's how inflation works. But voters don't care about the rate of change. They care about the absolute level. A gallon of milk that cost $3 in 2020 and now costs $4.20 doesn't feel better because it's no longer rising as quickly. The tariffs, far from making America wealthy, are functioning as a regressive tax that hits lower and middle-income households hardest. Because food, clothing, household goods, these are a larger share of income for poorer families. When these items become more expensive due to tariffs, it's the bottom 50% who feel it most acutely. Manufacturing is not coming back in any meaningful way in the short term. Some companies are exploring reshoring, yes, but it's a slow process. And in many cases, even with tariffs, it's still cheaper to import than to produce domestically. That's the reality of comparative advantage and decades of supply chain development. And the greatest economy narrative is contradicted by the lived experience of most Americans who are telling pollsters in overwhelming numbers that they're struggling with costs and that the economy is on the wrong track. So what happens now? Well, we have some clues. The off-year election results have clearly rattled the Republican Party. There's now open discussion about whether Trump's policies are politically sustainable going into the 2026 midterms. Historically, the party controlling the White House loses seats in midterm elections. Given that Republicans currently have a narrow majority in the House and a slim majority in the Senate, even a modest swing toward Democrats could flip both chambers. If that happens, Trump would be a lame duck president for the final 2 years of his term. No major legislation would pass. His agenda would be effectively frozen. Democrats would likely launch investigations. It would be political gridlock, which, ironically, markets sometimes like because it means no major policy changes. But it would represent a complete failure of Trump's political project. The other possibility is that Trump moderates, that he abandons or significantly scales back the tariff policy, that he focuses on areas of potential bipartisan agreement, that he stops attacking the Federal Reserve and allows monetary policy to work. But this would require admitting that his signature policies aren't working, and there's little evidence that Trump is psychologically capable of that kind of course correction. Let me talk for a moment about the international perspective, because this matters. I'm watching this from outside the United States, and the view from abroad is quite different from the domestic American narrative. The tariffs have caused significant pain in other economies. Japan's GDP contracted in the third quarter, first time in over a year. Switzerland's GDP fell. China's economy is struggling, with exports dropping and domestic demand weak. The global trading system is under strain. But here's the thing. This pain is creating political pressure in other countries too. And those countries are responding. China has retaliated with tariffs on American goods, particularly agricultural products. The European Union is preparing countermeasures. There's talk of forming alternative trading blocs that exclude the United States. Long term, this could fundamentally reshape global trade in ways that leave America isolated. The Trump administration seems to believe that because the United States has the largest consumer market, it has all the leverage. And there's some truth to that. But markets can be diversified. Companies can shift to other suppliers. Other countries can form their own trade agreements. Over time, if the United States is viewed as an unreliable trading partner, capital and commerce will flow elsewhere. We're already seeing this in capital markets. The dollar has fallen more than 8% this year. Now, a weaker dollar can boost exports. That's true. But it also makes imports more expensive, which feeds inflation. And if the dollar's decline is driven by concerns about American policy reliability, that's a problem. The dollar's status as the global reserve currency is based on trust in American institutions. That trust is not infinite. Let me address the government shutdown, because this is another factor compounding the economic and political problems. The United States is now experiencing the longest government shutdown in its history. Federal workers aren't being paid, government services are disrupted, and the economic impact is starting to show up in the data. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that shutdowns reduce GDP growth. There's a multiplier effect. Federal workers not getting paid means they cut spending, which affects businesses, which affects employment. It's a self-inflicted wound. And politically, the polls are clear. Americans blame Trump and congressional Republicans more than Democrats. About 60% are assigning responsibility to the Republican side. This is why the election results were so bad for Republicans. Voters are angry about the economy, angry about prices, and now also angry that the government can't even function normally. Trump's response has been to call for eliminating the Senate filibuster so Republicans can pass their agenda without Democratic votes. But this would require Senate Republicans to agree, and many are reluctant. The filibuster has been a key tool for the minority party for decades. Eliminating it would mean that when Democrats eventually regain power, they could pass their agenda without Republican input. It's a risky gambit. Now, I want to talk about something that I think is underappreciated in the American discourse. The cumulative effect of uncertainty. One of the most consistent findings in economic research is that uncertainty depresses investment, hiring, and consumption. When businesses don't know what policy will be next month, they postpone decisions. When consumers don't know what prices will do, they pull back spending. Trump's approach to policy has been characterized by constant reversals, threats, last-minute deals, and unpredictability. The tariff rates have changed multiple times. Trade agreements have been announced, then stalled, then revised. There was a major escalation in April, then exemptions and carve-outs, then the recent rollback on food items. This is terrible for economic planning. The Economic Policy Uncertainty Index, which measures policy uncertainty based on media coverage and other factors, spiked earlier this year to levels not seen since COVID. And sustained elevated uncertainty has real economic costs. The research suggests it can reduce investment by several percentage points. That means less business expansion, less job creation, slower growth. This matters because right now, the American economy is in a fragile position. Inflation is still above target. Growth is slowing. The labor market is showing signs of cooling, with job gains slowing significantly. The economy doesn't need additional shocks. It needs stability and predictability. It's getting the opposite. Let me now turn to what I think is the most important question. Is there a way out of this? Economically, yes. Politically, that's harder to say. Economically, the solution is straightforward. Gradually phase out the most damaging tariffs, allow the Federal Reserve to do its job without political interference, pass a budget to end the shutdown, and focus on policies that could have bipartisan support, like infrastructure investment or targeted tax relief for lower-income households. Would this solve all the problems? No. Inflation would still be above target. Prices would still be higher than 4 years ago. But it would stabilize the situation and allow the natural forces of competition and productivity growth to work. The problem is that this would require Trump to essentially admit that his signature policy, the tariffs, was a mistake. It would require him to stop attacking Powell. It would require him to compromise with Democrats on a budget. And based on his behavior over the past year, there's little indication he's willing to do any of that. So instead, we are likely to see more of what we've seen. Symbolic gestures like the food tariff rollbacks that provide minimal economic relief but create headlines. More attacks on Powell and the Fed. More proposals for gimmicks like rebate checks that sound good but don't address the underlying issues. And more political deterioration as voters continue to express their frustration at the ballot box. From a comparative perspective, it's worth noting that this pattern isn't unique to the United States. We've seen leaders in other countries try to use trade policy as a tool of economic nationalism. We've seen leaders attack central banks. We've seen governments promise quick fixes to complex economic problems. And the results are remarkably consistent. It doesn't work. Trade restrictions raise prices. Central bank interference undermines credibility. Quick fixes don't exist for structural economic challenges. These aren't controversial statements. They are based on decades of research and hundreds of natural experiments across countries. The tragedy is that there are real economic challenges facing the United States and other advanced economies. Productivity growth has slowed. Income inequality has widened. Many communities have been left behind by globalization and technological change. These are legitimate issues that deserve serious policy responses. But the response needs to be evidence-based. It needs to be grounded in what actually works, not what sounds good in a campaign speech. Invest in education and skills training. Reform the tax code to make it more progressive. strengthen the social safety net, support research and development, improve infrastructure. These policies take time, but they actually work. Tariffs as a tool of industrial policy can work in very specific, limited circumstances, protecting infant industries, addressing national security concerns, responding to unfair trade practices. But blanket tariffs on all imports from most trading partners, that's not industrial policy. That's just protectionism. And protectionism makes everyone poorer. Let me bring this back to the immediate situation. Trump is now facing a crisis of his own making. His approval ratings are at historic lows. His party just suffered a major electoral defeat. His signature policy is unpopular and demonstrably failing to achieve its stated goals. The government is shut down. He's in conflict with the Federal Reserve. The 2026 midterms are less than a year away and looking increasingly likely to result in Democrats taking control of Congress. He has options. He could course correct. He could build bridges to Democrats. He could focus on issues with broad support, but that would require a level of pragmatism and willingness to compromise that he has rarely demonstrated. More likely, I think, is that we'll see an increasingly desperate set of maneuvers aimed at changing the narrative. More attacks on political opponents, more claims that the economy is actually great and the problems are all media invention or democratic conspiracy, more symbolic policy changes that generate headlines but don't address the fundamental issues, and then the midterms will come. If Democrats take the House and possibly the Senate, Trump will spend his final 2 years as an embattled lame duck president. His legislative agenda will be dead. He'll be subject to investigations and oversight. It will be 2019 to 2020 all over again, except this time he won't be running for re-election. If Republicans somehow hold Congress despite the current trends, it will be because they managed to convince voters that things aren't as bad as they seem, or that Democrats would be worse. But that will be a very heavy lift, given the data we're seeing. You know, there's a concept in economics called rational expectations. The idea is that people make decisions based on all available information, including their expectations about future policy. If people expect high inflation, they'll demand higher wages, which leads to higher prices, which validates their expectations. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.